Ben Zimmer from the Connecticut Policy Institute is now across from me again. And Ben, I said last time when we started dissecting the numbers about how we look at the state of Connecticut, its past and its current performance on so many layers, that I wanted to have you back because I didn't think we had done full justice to the work that you've done. So welcome back to the program.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having me back.
Absolutely. Let me just ask you, we've seen some recent numbers that I'd love somebody who looks at numbers all the time to put in perspective. 8.1% unemployment, so it's not going down here in the state of Connecticut. And yet, by the statistics, which again are developed in different ways, one number to the next, 11,500 jobs in July, which would equate to about 7% of all the jobs created in America. We haven't seen performance like that. Yesterday, the governor said, I am the only one who's created jobs in the last 20 or 30 years. So.
Well, I think there's a few things to bear in mind. First of all, the Department of Labor measures two different statistics. One is a survey of Connecticut businesses, and the other is a survey of Connecticut residents. And so the unemployment rate is based on the survey of residents, where we've seen over the last 18 months and last few years a large drop in the number of residents employed. And even with the July numbers, that didn't change that much. And so that the combination of that and more people entering the workforce, more people looking for jobs, has led the unemployment rate to go up. Now, there's the separate survey, which is the one of businesses, which looks at how many people they have on their payrolls. And there we've seen throughout most of Governor Malloy's tenure, not to pick on him, since the beginning of the recession, we've seen Connecticut's job growth rate, growing a bit, but lagging well behind the rest of the country. The July numbers, if they hold up, would mean that so far in 2013, that growth is more in line with the rest of the country. But, the Department of Labor themselves will say that you can't read too much into any one number. And I think no one would really say that 7% of jobs in the United States in July came from Connecticut. Now, it is possible that this number is indicative of a trend that we are going to see higher growth. So I'm not trying to say it's meaningless, but it's just one small data point that's very different than the data we've seen before. So the next 5-6 months will be interesting to see, okay, is this, even if overblown, indicative of a larger trend, as, Governor Malloy would probably hope/claim.
Okay.
And
what you do, I know how this game works. You do as many interviews. Well, this is the number that is hanging out there. You do as many interviews as possible, and then, of course, the next month, if things don't quite continue along that path, then you don't do as many interviews.
Exactly. So, miraculously, you're out of the state and can't do one.
Okay, now, what we're talking about here, and again, we'll remind you where you can get this. The Connecticut Policy Institute, a nonprofit, not-for-profit research organization dedicated to developing responsible, research-driven public policy in Connecticut. Now, again, some of the founding of this from Tom Foley, and we explained last time what his role has been in this, rather marginal at this point.
Yeah, that's correct. Tom did found it, and we're very upfront about that, but at this point his role is completely advisory, and he has no formal connection.
Let me ask you, if he does announce that he's running for governor, will all of his relations to this nonprofit, nonpartisan group, will they all be attenuated, or will he continue in some way? I mean, again, you have a board of directors, you are an executive, you said many people were surprised when people said you were involved in a conservative think tank because you come out of Yale and you're a more moderate or liberal guy. So, I mean, they were surprised to hear that about you.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the campaign, my hope would be that every candidate for governor, including Governor Malloy, adopts all of our policy recommendations into their platform, because I think they're good policy recommendations, and like any think tank, ultimately you hope, politicians will adopt your ideas. But, in terms of Tom's relationship if he does end up running, I think it would be the same as what it's been the last few months, which is, again,
advisory.
Advisory, and not to the extent that we would always take his advice when we're putting out a paper. I'll maybe send it around to 8 or 9 experts, people who I think have some expertise before we publish it, just to get their input. Tom would be one of those. Some suggestions he has we'll take. Others I'll say, well, I don't agree with that. I'm not going to put it in. So.
Okay. If you have any questions about any of this, 203-757-1320. And again, in July, they put out Connecticut's economic scorecard. They looked at economic performance, fiscal policy, health outcomes, workforce quality, regulatory climate. I think we got through most of the fiscal policy, but not to the health outcomes or workforce quality. That's why I wanted to have you back. But why don't you recap? Because the way I synthesized it last time when you came on was basically that Connecticut has had this vaunted history, but we sat on a lot of our advantages and squandered them and kind of gave them up. And what you do, which I said to the audience I really liked, was you measured us using all kinds of different barometers across the country, different sourcing, and you did it to look at how we equate with other New England states, how we equate with other states across the country. So you make it very simple for somebody to go online and take a look at the source, whether it's the Bureau of Labor Statistics or wherever you got your information. Tell us again what you saw in our economic performance, fiscal policy, broadly speaking.
Well, I think you described it pretty accurately, that everyone knows Connecticut is all in all a wealthy state, and we have a lot of wealth that's accumulated over time. But in the last few years, the trajectory on a whole host of metrics, including our income, our jobs, all of these things have been negative, and you look to why, you can see that in the fiscal policy. Our taxes are among the highest, our debt is among the highest, our spending is among the highest, and as we'll get to today, I think some of these other things that people tend to associate as being great in Connecticut, like health outcomes and like workforce quality, are still relatively strong, but also are not necessarily moving in the right direction.
Okay, so again, one of the things, and I'll skip right to it and go back to health outcomes, we talk a lot about one of the things that we have banked, and I don't know how you bank workforce quality, because look, if you're not doing the same job, if your company moved years ago and there's no comparable job for you, you can't continue. Or if the industry moves so fast that what you used to do is not even done anymore, you walk into a factory shop today, you might say, this is Mars to me, even though I used to work in one for 40 years. So, the question of workforce quality, how did you go at that?
Well, there's a whole bunch of different ways to measure it. One of the standard ways that you see people across the country measuring it is through educational attainment. So the percentage of your workforce who's achieved a high school degree, an associate's degree, a bachelor's degree. And so one of the things we looked at was comparing Connecticut's workforce as a whole to other states and Connecticut younger workers. And what you see is that for the workforce as a whole, Connecticut has, one of the top ones in the country. Among younger workers, we're still above average, but we're not at the level we once were. And I think that's because, you talk to some people in Connecticut and just the Northeast in general. I think there's this misconception that's very dated that, well, our fiscal policies might not be so great, but, down in the South where, tax policy is better and fiscal policy is better, people have this sort of perception, frankly, that everyone down there isn't that smart, and that you should. By the way,
they do have indoor plumbing now, so
exactly. But the reality is that's not the case. You have all these areas in states with better fiscal policies, areas in Virginia, Research Triangle in North Carolina, Austin, Texas, Charleston, South Carolina. You can go on and on. All these places have very educated, skilled workforces. They're very cosmopolitan places where people want to live, and companies can find the workforce there to meet their needs, and they can do so while producing their goods and services at a much lower cost.
Well, let me ask you, all of you think tanks, you're all together, even though there have been some think tank wars here in the state of Connecticut in terms of legitimacy, but you're all in New Haven. For some reason, you're all down there where the heavy thunk goes on at Yale. But the question is, when you look at what CONCAN is saying, that it's going to take us 75 years on the track that we're on to ameliorate this problem we've got with an achievement gap. When you look at that, is it that our suburbs are just, roaring and doing such a great job, and so in distinction to those, we look at our cities doing so poorly, or is it that overall we're not doing as well as we used to?
It's the second one. So, for instance, there is a lot of talk about, the achievement gap, and that's a very valid thing to talk about. But yeah, it's important to know that leaving aside the strong performance of some of Connecticut's better public schools, the failing schools in our cities compare very poorly to schools in poor urban areas in other states. So, leaving aside the comparison to the rest of Connecticut, among low-income students, so students on the National Free and Reduced Lunch program, in 2011, our grade 4 math achievement was 47th out of 50 in the United States among low-income students. Our grade 8 math was 44th out of 50.
So we're talking about our kids comparably in a different, same socioeconomic status as other kids across the country.
Exactly.
Interesting, yeah. And when we employ this Common Core that everybody's talking about, we're all told we're all going to take a hit because it's going to test things that are a little bit, pithier, a little deeper. That's what we're told, and requires, really a lot more, getting into the subject matter. And are we going to be surprised, do you think, in Connecticut? We again think of ourselves as doing well. I mean, even your numbers without Common Core show us struggling, but I guess it will show everybody struggling to some degree.
Yeah, I don't know that Common Core will necessarily have too big an impact on the relative status of Connecticut because everyone is doing it, but I do think, you will see, and you've seen this around the country, as Common Core standards have been adopted, the sort of state-specific tests, all of a sudden scores drop a bunch. And that's not necessarily because people are learning less, it's because the standards have gotten higher.
Okay. Now, what about our high-achieving kids vis-a-vis other high-achieving kids in, those more privileged areas?
In those areas, I think, again, Connecticut, performs well. I think we neither stand out in particular, nor do we, nor do we suffer in particular. I think the main challenge facing, public education in Connecticut right now is in low-income urban areas where you have a lot of the, worst performing schools. But, I think, we should always raise our standards. And I mean, if you look compared, and I think this is part of what's behind the idea of the Common Core, is if you look compared to, educational achievement in places like Singapore or Japan, South Korea, the entire United States is lagging way behind. And so, I think even in our schools that aren't in quite as much crisis mode, there's still always, room for improvement, and we should always be aiming to, raise standards and see what we can do better.
Okay, now let me ask you a question. You talk about workforce quality, educational attainment, young working age residents, ages 25 to 34. Help me, because we've been trying to play this out on the air, and I wanted to get your impression of this. The state of Connecticut, with the cities that we have, the New Havens, the Waterburys, the Bridgeports, the Hartfords, and I'll leave aside Stamford just for the moment, but our largest cities. The question is, are we able even to keep these young attainers here in the state of Connecticut? They seem, by all accounts, by all of the other trends, that they want to stay in an urbanized area that's got everything they need. They don't want a car any longer. They, really want an urban lifestyle. And Boston obviously has that, and New York obviously has that. Are we at a distinct disadvantage because of the size, scope, and breadth of our cities?
Well, I think yes and no. I think, Connecticut, even traditionally, even kind of in the heyday of us doing better than we are today, it was not a place that was necessarily filled with a ton of young professionals, because it's a more suburban state, it had a lot more sort of, middle-aged people right as they, were starting their families, kind of middle of their career, late 30s and 40s. So Connecticut's workforce has always been a little bit older. Mm-hmm. I think part of the problem is that the young people who are here today were not necessarily getting the the young people who are here today, we're not setting them up to be as successful as we could, and in part that's because you have people coming out of public schools and coming out of this education system not getting the training they need. I do also think that Connecticut cities should be, revitalized, and to make them more attractive places for people to come in and live is something that's very important and very valuable. But, also at the end of the day, I think we talked about this last time, New Haven is not going to be New York City. And at least not in the near future, maybe in 70 years or something. But,
well, I can't see that.
Yeah.
By the way, his data source is the National Center for Education Statistics. And let me just roll over these very quickly. Grade 4 math. Now, we're talking about the low-income student achievement. We're 47th out of 50 in the U.S. Now, that kind of stuns me. We are 9th in the Northeast, and there are only 9 states that are represented in the Northeast. Achievement gap with the rest of the state, 50 out of 50 in the U.S., 9 out of 9 in the Northeast. Grade 4 reading. Now, we're told again that if kids are not really reading by grade 3, they're at a terrible disadvantage. We rank 33rd in terms of these NAEP scores for low-income students, 33 in the country, and 9th in the Northeast, worst again. And again, the distinction between rich and poor in the state in terms of the achievement gap, 50th out of 50, 9th out of 9 in the Northeast. Math is bad, too. I mean, all the way up and down the line in grade 8 and in grade 8 reading. We're 5th in the Northeast, and in the differential between the rich and poor, 8 out of 9 in the Northeast. I mean, these are not good numbers.
No, I mean, it's very disconcerting, and it's really one of the big challenges facing the state. And it's a problem that demands, to start kind of talking a bit about solutions, it's a problem that demands systematic change and not just kind of tweaking things on the margin here, tweaking things on the margin there. And, one of the things we've talked about in some of our other policy papers on education is, that while the sort of much heralded education reform bill of last year definitely included some positive elements, that it really didn't fundamentally restructure the way we fund schools and the way we hold school districts and hold school principals accountable. There's all this talk about teacher accountability, but that teacher accountability doesn't mean anything if the people who are, hiring and potentially dismissing teachers aren't accountable and don't have proper incentives themselves. And so, the whole system is really, filled with these kind of structural problems that entrench the status quo.
Well, I think part of it is, the whole notion of home rule in the state, even though it doesn't really exist, and the state constitution gives the state a lot of authority. They're very reluctant. They have been historically to use it. They're using it more today than they have with the intervention with the Commissioners Network and the Alliance schools. But still, I think they're going to be less ready to jump than maybe other states that in the past have had more willingness to do that. Now, workforce quality, I mean, basically, to sum it up, you say that Connecticut's advantage in educational attainment has slipped in recent years. So that kind of goes along with some of the economic performance numbers. They do often go hand in hand. But if you are to recover to a meaningful degree, aside from other policy changes that you would like to see, how important is this one to the ultimate recovery of a state like ours, which I think in the past, again, we held out as one of our bona fides, our educational attainment?
I think it's critical. I mean, I think that, we talk a lot about, fiscal policy, and fiscal policy is critical too, but it's not the only thing that matters. And, the quality, in surveys of employers, you talk to employers, I in a previous job once was involved in deciding for a company where to locate a manufacturing plant. Workforce capabilities make a big difference. And so to the extent that Connecticut excels in this area, it's important. But I mean, it's all critical. You know, it's a very competitive economic environment out there. And, you know, I think, again, the point is it's not either or. You look at a place like the Research Triangle, they've got one of the, you know, top, you know, educational attainments in the country, an area with an incredibly capable workforce. But you also have a state that has, you know, way lower taxes than Connecticut. Its debt problems are, you know, much more under control. And so, you know, companies can, you know, almost, to use the, you know, the pun of the day, they can have it all. And so, as if Connecticut is going to compete, we have to provide it all too.
Okay, I'll tell you what. Got to take a quick break. Let's come back and give a brief synopsis of the regulatory climate in the state of. Okay, so we talk a lot about regulation in the state. Ben Zimmer from the Connecticut Policy Institute. Things even like healthcare mandates, which we're all running up against as we go to these exchanges. Things like licensure needed in various of the, you know, functions here in the state, whether you're, you know, looking at x-rays, whatever you may be doing. So tell us, what is our regulatory climate like?
Well, the state's regulatory climate is poor, and that's something you hear about all the time. And one thing we've tried to do in this report is provide some specific, actual quantifiable metrics to understand that. And so we've selected certain types of regulations, as you pointed out, like health insurance mandates, occupational licensing requirements, and just tried to illustrate how much more severe Connecticut's are than most others. So, for instance, we license almost twice as many occupations as most other states, as the national average.
Okay, but somebody might say, yeah, you can look at that as half full or half empty, that we are requiring tattoo artists now to have a little licensure so that they're not, you know, whatever, doing to us. You know, I mean, so some could look at that as a benefit or a drawback.
Yeah, it's a good point. One of the things that we've looked at in a paper we put out on regulations is that a lot of studies of licensing have showed that they actually reduce quality rather than increase it. Because what they do is they limit the number of people who can apply for jobs, and so that insulates established providers from competition, and in turn makes them less likely to produce good quality. So if you actually look at studies comparing quality through things like accidents, consumer satisfaction, states that license professions to states that don't, for most professions, the quality performance is actually better in the states that don't license it, that let, you know, the market competition enhance quality than otherwise.
Okay, that's interesting. You even get into maximum mandated weekly unemployment insurance. We're 46th in the nation, 7 out of 9 in the Northeast if you annualize that. So I'll tell you, the reason that I wanted to have you back is to make certain that our audience, as we're going into another election cycle next year in 2014, some really good information that you have culled from all kinds of places to put Connecticut in some perspective with states in the Northeast and states here. And folks, it's very readable. How do we get it, Ben?
You go to our website, www.ctpolicyinstitute.org, and you can also Google Connecticut Policy Institute, and the scorecard is right on the front page right now as one of our recent policy papers, and you can just click on that, and it's right there.
Okay, Ben Zimmer, this was part 2, or Ben Zimmer 2.0. Thank you so much for being with us. A pleasure.
1.1, maybe.
This is WATR in Waterbury, back with Open Law.